Thanks for being here.
Hey, it's good to be with you guys.
It's good to see you. Let me give you a little introduction here, at least table by table. So this table is Westover Hills here in Austin. We're meeting at their place this time. This is the Southwest Church in Jonesboro, Arkansas. This is College Side from Cookeville, Tennessee. And this is Murray Hills from Columbia, Tennessee. And we've been working together over the last year in a Multiplying Church Cohort, working on projects. And earlier we've done one theme for each meeting, but this meeting we've got 3 themes. And one of the themes they wanted to work on was developing a culture of generosity, and so that's why you're here. We're looking forward to it. So let me have share a prayer, and then Tim, why don't you give us just a quick background of yourself, and then take us into what you're doing. And I've got a flip chart, and I'll probably be taking some notes on the flip chart for us, and we end up putting those on the wall. So we have about an hour for you to take us into what you want to take us, and then about 30 minutes of Q&A, or if you want to reorganize that, this time is yours, and feel free to do that.
Okay, great.
Let me pray. Father, just to have your grace shown to us is a tremendous thing. But for us to be able to pull that grace into our lives and then to re-express it out as we become people of generosity, that is another skill, another practice altogether. I thank you for Tim and how he has looked at this and studied this and then worked it out in churches that he has been leading as pulpit minister. Father, I just pray that we are able to hear well some things that he has learned and can share to us, and that we can find ways to practice and re-express those things in our own churches. So thank you for this very sweet and honorable time together. In Jesus' name, amen. It's yours, brother.
Well, thank you. Let me know if there's a problem and you can't hear me, because I know that these things can, at the time, get a little bit weird, but I really appreciate you guys' efforts to do this. I've always felt like any time that leaders make a sacrifice of their time and energy and resources to improve, that God bless that. I'm really honored to be with you guys. Some of you guys I know pretty well, and others of you I've never met before, and so it's always good to meet some new people. Just to let you know a little bit about something I'm going to share with you. Some of this is the product of my Doctor of Ministry project thesis that I wrote at Abilene Christian. And if you want the details of, you actually want to read it, word for word or something like that, you can find it in the Abilene Library. If you want to, you can also copy through it. But I wrote it as 140-something pages on it, plus the bibliography, in an effort to address a very particular need that I had at a certain point in my ministry, which was I came into the Highland Oaks Church of Christ in Dallas when I was 26 years old, and I was replacing Jim, who had been there for 30 years, and at the time, the church had been through a really difficult season for a while, and had gone through a prolonged period of decline. And one of the things I noticed when I got there, other than the red ink that was involved, was that from a spiritual standpoint, the different things that I observed, conversations I had with people, the way that people refer and walk with Christ in terms of money and possessions, the response I got when I talk about money or giving or stewardship or any of those things didn't seem to be real healthy to me. And of course, that could be said in the case of a lot of people in a lot of churches, but it really weighed on me heavily. And so when I got the opportunity to write something, and I knew pretty early what I was going to do. And that was, I wanted to see, is there a way that this can be that what's existed can be kind of slowly and carefully deconstructed, and that something different can be put in its place. And so a lot of that, what I did in the course of that project was I went away with a group of people from the church that were kind of picked as a sample based on a variety of criteria. We went away for a weekend and did some, what the missional guys would call communal discernment. And all of the findings in there are actually listed in the, you guys have gone dark to me, now you're back. Okay, good. That those findings are there, are in the report, and I'll allude to some of them as we go. But I did that then with the purpose of, could we create a repeatable 2-year spiritual formation process that we implemented it would actually lead to a more generous heart in the life of the church and its leaders, and hopefully that would manifest itself in generous action. So there's that, and then the other part I'm gonna dribble in here is some of the stuff I just experienced both at Highland Oaks, the churches I served before, and where I am now at New Vintage Church, where when we started this church, we started with 4 full-time staff members. We had no outside support at the time. And so you have to get pretty creative with how you organize funds, and then you actually, with a blank slate, you have the opportunity now to create whatever culture you like in certain ways. I mean, Satan will oppose it and twist it and contort it and things, but you don't have a lot of the stuff that you have in an established church that maybe needs to be reconstructed in order for you to do this. And it's really just to walk you through some of the research that I did, some of the findings I did, or that I came away with, and also just a little bit of my experience, and be wide open to your guys' questions. And I know a lot of your churches, but probably out of the 4 churches represented here, you may do this quite well, and half of you may be struggling right now. Can I ask for a show of hands since I can see them? Right now, as it stands, how many of you guys in your churches are running over budget right now? Meaning you've, your spending is over what you've got in red right now.
So you're spending more than you're taking.
Yeah, raise your hand. It's all right. 80% of churches in America are in that camp right now, but apparently none of you, right? So everybody's in the black and just fine. Maybe I should just leave or whatever. Now, this is a time in church where usually most churches are running a deficit of some kind, and then they make it up at the end of the year, and that's very normal. But let me ask one more question. How many of you in your churches does the preacher have access to what people give? None. Okay.
1.
Oh, 1. Okay, 2. 2 of the 4. Okay, good. I want to talk a little bit about that kind of as we go here. So once we did that project, I brought in 2 external experts to kind of vet the project, make sure it all lined up in a healthy way. One of them from the church side was Bob Russell, who was the senior pastor at Southeast Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky for a long time, and had written a book on the matter. And then from the more scholarly side, I availed myself of Earl Lavender at Lipscomb to just kind of look at it from more the theological and the spiritual formation side. And so all of this has been kind of vetted and tested by them as well. So with all that in mind, let's go ahead and dive in. Now, since we're good restorationists, a lot of times we begin with scripture and we begin with theology. So I'll go ahead and begin there, but I also recognize that you guys had studied a lot of this in your own right, and probably the reason that you're coming here is for more of the pragmatic, so I'm going to wait. But one of the things that I would say is that the entire subject of generosity as a whole is something that is really not a minor theme in the Bible. It is a major, 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 major theme that can be traced from that's through Revelation. It goes into the very nature and essence of God. It goes into the Trinity and things like that, and I elaborate on it in the paper. But let me just give you a few theological points that maybe for your preaching or your next elders meeting or whatever. But this one of the biggest hurdles is this kind of Gnostic almost dichotomy that people draw between money and my spiritual life. That's like financial, and then my spiritual life is over here in a different camp. Or that somehow when you preach a sermon on giving or whatever, and somebody's heart is stirred, that we allow them to get away with the myth that somehow they should never feel guilty or bad about anything with regards to their money and possessions. God the generous, that concept that God begins really all of human existence with giving, whether it's the gift of light at creation, the giving of his Son in Jesus Christ, or the numerous times that he sympathizes for creation all the way through. God's essence is is really generous. And because we are created in his image and we are indwelled by his spirit, there is something that ought to be characteristic of Christians. If God himself is generous and we're created in his image, we're indwelled by him and follow his son, who was the very representation of him, and in whom his fullness dwells, then that ought to be something that's characteristic of Christians. Now, one of the tricky parts of that is generosity is defined differently by different people. So we'll come to that in a bit. One way that you can go is one of the mind-blowing concepts that I got from Miroslav Volf, actually. He wrote a book called Free of Charge that I would recommend. Very, very good book. But he, in there, talks about God as the non-receiving giver, meaning that God is the only one who gives and has never received in order to give. And you could really, if you spend a whole lot of time thinking about that, that will blow your mind when you start thinking about the implications of that. Meaning when we give to God, we're not giving back to him what he gave us, things like that. And that when God makes use of our resources and multiplies them, he's not doing it because he has to have them. God has it all under his dominion. And he never received anything from us. He needs nothing from us, and yet he gives to us freely anyway. And that because he's God and because his spirit indwells us and we're created in his image, that begins to be a pattern for how we go about the process of generosity. We don't give because the person on the receiving end is worthy, because that's not how God is given toward us. God gives freely to us. It's not merit-based, for instance, and things of that nature. That's another way that you could go. Obviously, I've already mentioned kind of the idea of being created in the image of God. I want to really, really strongly, as we get going, just emphasize for the future of your preaching and teaching on the subject, the idea that generosity is something that ought to take place in community versus privacy. In the project, I talk a ton about privacy and individuality and how that actually begins to erode things. And then if you took that and you applied it to almost any other aspect of life in general, any aspect of the spiritual life, it would make sense. I, for instance, from the pulpit, have said here at New Vintage, it's interesting that I will have people come in to me for counseling, and they will say things and admit things going on in their life that are absolutely, mind-boggling. Sins that they've got going on, something that's going on with one of their kids, stuff that would very much be private, quote unquote, to most people. But when they find out that I know what they give, then they get offended. And so I've always found that interesting that despite how relatively benign actually knowing what a person's giving is, how strongly of a hold that has on people spiritually and emotionally. But we accept a level of privacy and individuality when it comes to giving that we would never to life. And it's worth doing some reflection as to why that is the case. I've talked about God as the free giver. Also, generosity, I'm going to assert to you, is really not an act. Generosity is something that is a state of heart that usually manifests itself in action. But most of you probably have people at your church who give a lot of money that aren't particularly generous people. They're not generous-hearted people. They may give substantial amounts of money, but not be acutely generous. Generosity is something that God, a work that God does in us as we continue to grow, as we grow spiritually. And I just want to submit that to you kind of as I begin here, that those are all parts of this puzzle. So, everybody still hearing me okay? And everything? You guys go in and out on me a little bit visually, but I'm going to assume you're there unless Stan buzzes me and tells me that we're offline. So here we go. What I found was, in all the churches that I researched, all of the articles I read, and all of the people that I talked to at Highland Oaks, that one of the keys to the entire thing was a perceived lack of generosity in leadership. And so as we began to turn the ship slowly, when they witnessed and were privy to, and when we actually started acting in a more generous fashion, that began to slowly turn the tide. When churches are not generous, when churches are stingy. people struggle with what I would call a scarcity mentality. It usually begins with the leaders. I wrote a blog post for churchleaders.com about a year and a half ago that went bananas online, partially because of the title that they gave it. That's not the title I gave it, but I think the title they gave it was something like why we force our staff to tithe. Okay, that was not my title, that was their title. Mine was basically, I just simply said, here's why anybody that is to, and we have elders, we're going to ask them to tithe too. And really it boils down to not just convictions we have with regards to what the Bible teaches about it, but it's also something that allows us to ask others to give with integrity. So if I get up, for instance, I'm not giving to the church, and I am asking them to give to the church, that lacks integrity. And what we found when it came time to do elder selection, for instance, and I suggested that all the elders on a tithe, like all the staff was being asked to do. They actually approved that as a standard for our staff, but at the time, they split right down the middle and that should be required of elders, which I thought was really interesting. And so when we walked through that together, basically what we came down with was, all right, why don't we take a couple of months if you're not doing it now, or if you're in financial straits or something, and you need some time to get this right, go ahead, because in a couple of months, me and the chair, we're going to go ahead and we're going to look and we're going to see if you're giving regularly to the church or not. And it was amazing how almost instantly it went up by about $4,000 a week. Yes, I said a week. And it was because our leadership was not giving at the time. Now, I'm going to take for granted that all of you have enough emotional IQ to know what's confidential here and what's not. Please don't tell that story at a lectureship somewhere or pass that on. But in as much as it can help you understand some of the truths of just the reality of situations in everyday life at churches I've been a part of, I would highly, highly recommend to you. Now, I know there are people who would quarrel with whether or not tithing ought to be something that would be, forced, quote unquote, in the Bible or whatever, but I have my own opinions on that and respect those of others. I actually do believe that that's something that's taught in the Bible. If you don't, that's fine. I think we can still be friends. But even if you don't, I would ask you to take some pretty serious thought into, okay, if it's not tithing, what kind of biblical standard would be set for people based on what you read in the New Testament? And is it reasonable to think, for instance, that if when Jesus talks about the law, let's just say that a person is a hardcore dispensationalist and they say, tithing was Old Testament and those kinds of things. Well, when Jesus actually goes to interpretation of the law, you take the Sermon on the Mount as an example, and he takes things, you've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you, don't even look at a woman lustfully, okay, as an example. And he does that with all sorts of things as he goes through. If he had spoken to the issue of tithing, what do you think he would have said? Do you really think that what he would have said is, you've heard it said, give 10%, and I say give nothing, or it doesn't matter, or anything like that? I think it's a lot more reasonable to say that, even in his line to the Pharisees in Matthew 23:23, when he talks about, you tithe on everything you get, but you neglect the weightier matters of the law. You should have done the latter without neglecting the former. Okay, a lot of people dismiss that quickly too, or they'll say, things that are don't, to me at least, hold up very much under biblical weight. And so I'm going to give you a very quick tool that we did at Highland Oaks that when I said it first time, we could have heard a pin drop, but it was extremely, extremely important and a turning point in the life of that church. And I just said it within the 4 weeks of starting at New Bench Church. But one of the things that will depress you, but it's really important for you, because we as ministers we believe highly in our people and our leadership. But if you took take your offerings, your total offerings for the year, and basically just assume everybody's tithing, you can reverse mathematically and back up into then our median income as a church is X. okay? And most of the churches that I've been with and consulted with, that number is somewhere, meaning if you, let's say you got X amount of families and you got X amount of total offerings, if you assume everybody's tithing 10% of that is your hypothetical, this is what our median income is. At Highland Oaks, I think it was $11,000 a year, would have been our median income. When I was in North County in San Diego, I think it was about 14,000. And here at New Vintage, it's around 23,000. Meaning if we're all tithing, then that means our median income in this church is $23,000 a year. And when you put it in perspective, keeping in mind that the areas of those churches, North Dallas and 2 in San Diego, California, that's not a lot of money. And I often will follow it up with, you'd never know we were that broke if you saw our houses or our cars in the parking lot, that we were doing that bad. Now that may sound really, really cynical and jaded and all of that stuff, but I think until the leader owns the fact that some hard facts about what actually is going on in church, things are unlikely to turn around or get better. Because the burden that it takes, the spiritual burden that a leader needs to have, discipleship, has to be strong enough, has to be felt, and strongly enough that one is willing to then endure the pain that it's going to take to make the change. And one of those can be taking a look at things like that might be there. I heard Bill Hybels say something once that I buy into completely, and that is, for the preacher of the church, whether you want to admit it or not, you're also the chief fundraiser of the church. Okay. Now, I hate the term fundraiser. You can say, the elders of the church or whatever, but his point was the person that's preaching has the microphone open for 35 minutes every weekend. And they're the ones that the church knows the best, relationally, and things of that nature. And he said, so the more you can get comfortable with that role and embrace it as something that provides opportunity for your church, rather than an opportunity for you to go splat as a leader, the better off you're going to be. But if leaders don't in this process, if you're unwilling to ask your people to give, if you're unwilling to go through the pain that it's going to take to maybe make some of the shifts that you're going to need to make, then it's going to be a difficult road, because leaders are going to have to lead the way. Here are a few observations, and again, this is part of the deconstruction phase. We'll do the constructive phase here before long, but bear with me. These are facts that I have verified to one level or another. Some will be generalizations. You'll be able to tell which those are. Some of this will be based on whether you know in or not at your church. I personally feel like it's very hard to effectively shepherd people without knowing this information, and yet I have colleagues who really feel strongly that they couldn't handle it, and if that's the case, then I applaud you not knowing. I think that's the right way to go. If you do feel like you can handle it, I would highly recommend that you do so. And here's why. You would be very appalled to know how many people just flat out, I'll use the term lie about their giving. It is not uncommon for somebody to come up to me and say, you know what, well, if you do that, I'm going to stop giving. And they're not giving anything, as it is, but they want to convey that they are. Or they tell another Christian that they gave X to X project, and that never happened. Or you will hear stories about, oh, you know what, I don't give to church, I give over there to X and Y parachurch ministry or United or this children's home or whatever. Well, statistically, that's hogwash. Most of the people that don't give to their local church don't give anywhere else either, and that's why most philanthropic groups view as a leading indicator of a person's potential giving potential to their charity is whether or not they give to their local church. Professional nonprofit fundraisers look at church giving as an indicator of a person's capacity to give elsewhere. And what they found is that if a person isn't giving regularly to their local church and they're a Christian, for instance, then they're not likely to give to them either. And that's because as we get going, you'll learn it's a worldview thing. There's a rule of a third, and I've used this in my class at the Pepperdine Bible lectures before, and every time people shake their head like that can't possibly be true. I found it to be true everywhere I've been and everywhere I've ever done any consulting, which would be dozens of different churches of all stripes all over the country. And here's what it is. It's called the rule of a third. You're going to want to write this part down. The rule of the third is this, and I've repeated it, maybe it's gone up $1 or $2 since then, but in the average church, 1/3 of the people give $500 a year or more, basically $10 a week. The second third gives somewhere between $0 and $10, and the third gives absolutely. Now that applies regardless of demographics. You can go to anywhere, you can go rich, poor, whatever, it all breaks down the same way. I got that number from Paul Gage, who is one of 2 of the leading voices out there on the whole subject of fundraising. And when I heard it, I was at Highland Oaks, and I was going through professional fundraiser training. And he said that, and I said, surely not us. The margin of error on that, by the way, is 5%. Meaning you might find that in your church, 37% give this and 31% give this. But in general, I found that rule to be true. And if you don't think it is, let me encourage you to go actually clean up your membership rolls and then come back and run it again. It's eerie how that number is. And so when you have a church that it gives a lot more than another church, usually it's because the people who are giving $500 or a year or more, that you got people that are giving big money on the top end. But in terms of the percentage of people in the churches and what they're giving, that number is pretty darn accurate. And if you clean up your rolls and you actually do some looking at what people give, it's on target. So if in any church, people knew that. I've actually literally at one point, as I look to the left, look to the right, one of the 3 of you isn't giving anything. One of you is giving $10 a week or less, and somebody's giving $10 a week or more. That's true almost no matter where you go in the country. That stands true. And that was something that when I actually became aware of that at Highland Oaks, helped me get comfortable with that I felt and lead me to keep going. Let me also add to it, especially because a lot of you are from the South, and there are a lot of, especially in Churches of Christ, a lot of parachurch organizations, children's homes, things of that nature are all located down there and do an awfully wonderful work, and they do a great job of beating the pavement out there. You'll have people say, oh, well, I'm going to give X to this, and I don't give to the church, I give to that. Again, let me just reemphasize that in general, that is not true, okay? And some of you probably sit on boards of some of those charitable organizations and know that to be the case. And that doesn't mean that you should resent or anything the other organizations or whatever, but again, the bigger point here, that money has enough of a spiritual power to it that it causes people to be dishonest in conveying their heart, their deeds, and that in many cases, they're just not being truthful with themselves, with God, or with the church. I mean, going back, it's that long into the new church's life in the book of Acts, and you got Ananias and Sapphira doing the same thing. And it shouldn't really surprise us that somebody else would do that somewhere along the way. I would encourage you, if you're looking for a launch point, and then I'll get into the actual, some of these principles in the plan itself, just understand that what you should be aiming for is overall giving involvement. Meaning if you're doing a wage war, don't look at how much money's coming in. That's a short-term view of things. If you're looking at the long-term, what you want to see is, I'm going to attack the lack of involvement, meaning looking for the percentage of people who actually give regularly to go up. I'm less concerned about the dollars. I'm more concerned about, if we had 66% of our people that are doing $10 a week or less, or we have 1/3 of people that are doing nothing. Can we wage war on? Now it's 10% of our people that are giving nothing. Because in the long run, statistically and otherwise, you're going to do better the higher the involvement rate is. The more diversified your church's financial situation is. And so should a big giver block, it's not that big of a deal to you, or not as big of a deal to you because your donor base is little, quote unquote, more broad. But also, what you're wanting is for this to be a community thing. This is where our culture is engaged at every level. We want to make sure that that we're that people are engaged in every aspect of discipleship, okay? Let me give you just a couple of generic points, and then I'll give you kind of a plan on how we do it at New Vintage and how we did it at Highland Oaks. But in general, when it comes to making an appeal for funds, and most of you probably know this, vision will be needed every time. I would encourage you as strongly as possible to, when you get up, need is rooted in scarcity, and vision is in abundance. Vision comes at it with the lens of, I think God can do this. I believe that God will provide. Need comes from, we don't have enough, and if you don't do this, then this won't happen. Vision works better, it works much, much better to maybe point out something where you saw God do a mighty thing, and then say to the church, wouldn't you like to see more of that? Or wouldn't we like to have more of that possible? Or if this happens, we're going to be able to help X amount of kids, as opposed to, if you don't do this, this is how many kids are going to starve. There's a huge difference between those perspectives. And one of the things that we find in churches where people do get on board is that their worldview or the theology that they bring to the whole subject of generosity is not rooted in scarcity, it's rooted in abundance. If you take the story of the feeding of the 5,000, there's one way of looking at it. Hey, you tell everybody to go home because all we've got is a brown bag lunch here and we can't feed everybody. So, oh shucks, there's not enough to go around. Okay? Versus the other, give them to me, Jesus says, and then the next thing you know, everybody's filled and there's a bunch of leftovers, right? We're looking for that mentality that Jesus has. It says there's always enough because we're dealing with God, and God has all of the cattle. He has all of the resources, all of the food, all of the rain, all of the stuff that provides this. And so rooting your approaches when you need to appeal to something is much, much stronger. So for instance, we just started a capital campaign here at Advantage. This is our campaign in 3.5 years. Not something I would normally do if you're starting in a church. But this one's going to allow us to remodel. Our church building was given to us for free. Didn't pay anything for it, but it's falling apart around us. So we're having to go to the church and ask them to support a remodel of our children's ministry facilities. We're actually still being on the one before it, which was a remodel of the worship space. But instead of me going to them and saying, have you seen the squalor that our children are in? You don't want to see that continue, feed the children, so to speak, as opposed to, help cast a vision for them about what the finished thing is going to look like, and helping them understand that God can do this. God has called us to do this. With what would come our way through God's act of generosity toward our church is the opportunity for us now to be generous and be kind towards generosity here in the church, and helping them, get a picture of kids learning about Christ, of teachers having what they need to be able to teach effectively, of all of those kinds of things. You're going to get much, much further with that long term than if I say, if we don't do this, no young families are ever going to come to church here. Okay, you guys see approach these things. There is a way of leading that is positive and abundance-based that many of you in that room probably already have, but I can't reinforce strongly that vision will be needed absolutely every time. Bob Walker, who is on the board at Pepperdine, but also is the head of development at Texas A&M University, I was lucky enough to get a plane flight sitting next to him. We were actually had to be on somebody's private jet, which was not mine. Just want to point that out. It was a church member who was going to a board at Pepperdine, and he happened to fly along, and I was in the back. The church member at the time was flying the plane, but I got a chance to pick his brain about raising money for the plane flight from Houston to LA at that point in time. And I asked him, I said, look, I got to ask you, there's a guy who has to raise hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Give me some pointers. And he said, well, I'll boil it all down for you in 4 or 5 words. Here you go. He said, all it takes to raise money is a worthy cause and a worthy asker. And he says, and of the two, a worthy asker is more important. And I thought to myself, well, if I have a worthy cause, then that's really about all I need to be able to, the cause should sell itself. And he says, well, it can't. And he says, but you're not going to get, he used the term the big money. He's a fundraiser, right? So that's how he sees things. Now, you're not going to get the big money that way. In order to have that, you got to have both. He says, because sometimes when you're in church work, there are going to be causes that aren't particularly exciting. And people don't want to pay for a new air conditioning system. They don't want to pay parking lots. They don't want to do whatever. And so if you don't have a worthy asker, and by that he means have a preacher, particularly, whoever's doing the ask, elders or preachers, or whomever is actually doing the ask, that the people really believe in, not just that they're a nice person. He was very, very purposeful about that. He said they have to believe that if I give this person money, that it's going to be handled well, and that this is actually going to get spent well. By that, what he didn't mean they're going to be cheap in how they do things. He actually meant kind of the opposite. And in his experience, people who help fund ministries, they want to know that the people who are using it are, that if I'm donating to this, that this is actually going to get some mileage. They're going to get the ball down the field with this. And so do I trust the elders? Do I trust whoever it is that's making the ask? And then is it a worthy cause? If you have a nice person who's asking for a cause that doesn't merit anything, then you're going to struggle to get there too. So that concept of the worthy cause and the worthy asker, throw that in there here as we're doing the opening mashup for things. All right, let's talk a little bit about the process. One of the things that, the way I've put it in seminars that I've taught is step one is to stop plowing under your own crops. There are a lot of very subtle ways that I think we preachers in our passion, and especially if we're trying to make a missional move, right now, for instance, it's very, very in vogue for people to talk about, how church isn't just what happens inside the building, it's what happens everywhere. Worship is about all of life. It's not just about what we do on Sundays, and I'm not saying I disagree with any of that, other than potentially an emphasis. What you're doing is you're causing people to feel emotionally that what is happening in the building is not as important as you think it is. And it's separate and apart from the Lord's Supper. When we have, now you can say, well, it was separate and apart. I would make an argument to the contrary, actually. Jeff Childers helped me out with this. He was on my committee. And I tried to address that issue. And he said, well, Tim, if you go away, just from a church history standpoint, he says, how do you think the bread and wine got there? Somebody brought it as part of their offering. That's how it happened. They were very much tied together. They weren't nearly as separate and apart as we have in the early church practice as we think they are. They were very much woven together. Now that doesn't mean that you can't or shouldn't delineate, because I know where we get the theology of the other from. But sometimes what we say is the offering is so completely other than the Lord's Supper that even if we have a person get up and do a communion thought, we allow them to put massive emphasis on communion and don't hold them remotely accountable for bringing something meaningful theologically or challenging into what they say about giving. So tell me if this sounds familiar. It does at most of the churches I've been a part of. If you have somebody from the pew that's doing a communion thought, they get up and they'll opine about a whole bunch of things regarding communion, but then when it comes time to give, they'll just say, let's pray. I mean, there'll be nothing said. Because they're as nervous about talking about money as many church leaders are. And so we don't realize that when extreme language like, what we need to do is get out of the building, we need to do this and that and the other, that one of the things that happens is we're nudging people emotionally to distance themselves from what actually does take place in the building. It includes the good stuff. Not just the bad stuff or the hyper-emphasis. We're saying to them, in a matter of speaking, that what we're doing here and what you find meaningful and valuable is not as important as you think it is. And so I would encourage us to stop using, to work on using language that maybe is a little bit more inclusive. Put some thought into the language you use. When I asked the group that we went away with, which of the terms for giving do you prefer? Giving, offering, tithe, contribution, there was a list of 8 or 9 things that we often referred them to. Offering was by tenfold the most popular. They said, and I said, why do you like it? And they said, well, because it's spiritual. And I thought to myself, now, what about it makes it seem more spiritual than contribution or giving or things like that? And what we boiled it down to was that actually it was a term that they didn't use very much growing up. And it did, they were able to unhitch the wagon from the way that giving had been viewed in their growing up years, and it put a new twist, or it allowed for more theological space for them to be able to contemplate the entire thing. And so, think about how you talk about it. Contribution would lead a person to, that's a way of a person saying, what else do we contribute to? I contribute to a lot of things. I have my ideas to projects and things like that, but it tends to have a little bit of a lean of individuality. This is me giving something, whereas offering has a much more a surrendering kind of posture to it as a word. Giving is fine, but a lot of people, there are just certain connotations that go with it. So now here at Advantage we use offering. We've got other ways that we plow under our own crops sometimes is we will apologize, we preachers do, for talking about money. I would encourage you, don't ever do that. I think it was the 4th sermon that I ever did was on mission, and I made it very clear during that. I said, God uses people in all sorts of ways, not just your hands, but everything, our resources to help move the kingdom ball down the field. I probably worded better than that in the sermon, but what I was trying to help understand is we're going to talk about this openly. We're going to talk about giving. If we're preaching through a book of the Bible and there's a text on giving that's in there, we're going to preach through it. If you can expect that at a minimum, once a year, I'm going to do no less than a 2-week series on it, and usually I'm going to do a month. And it's usually in January. And there are several versions of that series that I've done over the years. But you need to learn to preach and do it on a regular basis, especially out of season. One of the big mistakes we get and we make, I think, as preachers is to wait until we have a need or we have a campaign coming up and then talk about giving when we don't talk about it any other time. And what it does, people that don't want to give to something an out, it allows them to say, the only reason he's talking about this is because of, they want my money or like that. Whereas if we talk about it on an ongoing basis and it's couched really well in terms of your walk with Christ and how important it is to Jesus, then they're more receptive to it when it is in season, because it's not out of the blue. It's none of that kind of stuff. In terms of the plan, let me just walk you through exactly what I came up with. And this again was vetted by Earl Lavender, Bob Russell, and some others. I wanted to be short enough that people, we could implement it, and that people who are coming into the church new would not have to wait years for the merry-go-round to circle back around to them. And I also wanted it to transcend preaching, just the pulpit, because if you're really going to create a culture, that certainly can be done from the pulpit, but it's a lot longer. And if there's ever a preacher swap or a transition in the pulpit, or something else has to happen there, there's just the spiritual life just takes a lot more than preaching to develop it. Preaching certainly a valuable part, but we've got to find a way to get the whole thing back into the laps of the people and get them to take responsibility for their own growth with Christ. So we devised a 2-year repeatable spiritual formation pathway. And I would be happy to email you this chapter out of my project if you would like me to. I just ask that you don't reproduce it, other than maybe for your elders or whoever. Don't post it to a blog or something like that, because eventually this is going to end up in a book somewhere, and I don't want to have to struggle for rights or whatever over that material. But I'd be happy to give it to you guys. I want you to picture it like a vortex or a tornado going up. It's a spiritual growth model that's used in education and in spiritual formation for a very long time. The idea is that it's like a funnel, except in many funnels it starts wide and goes down. This one works the other way, starts narrow and then goes broadly. There are 3 categories of spiritual practices that I kind of came up with, one that is kind of the category ongoing spiritual practices. Those are the ones that are just structured into life as a Christian, and that with no effort, you're going to be forced to do it anyway, no matter what. So weekly giving would fall into that category, for instance. An ongoing spiritual practice of the church that requires no effort to be exposed to it. It's something that's just already in your habits, it's already in the life of the church, or organized into your own individual spiritual experience structurally, okay? Regular giving would be an example. Church attendance would be another one. And let me just say that, okay, while we're on the subject of not everywhere and not just in the building, the number one indicator of a person's ability to give over time is actually church attendance, okay? Number two is involvement, but the leading indicator of whether or not they're actually going to give regularly is whether or not they go to church regularly. And so we need to understand that to whatever extent we actually de-emphasize church attendance, we're also ultimately de-emphasizing giving. It's something to think about. It's a way we plow under our own crops, but I digress. Regular giving being what you would call ongoing practices, okay? Then I'm borrowing language from Dallas Willard here. There are disciplines of abstinence and disciplines of engagement, okay? And so what I chose to do was to say, what if instead of us coming up with whole completely new practice, what we did was we looked at the implications of some of the classic spiritual disciplines on giving, how we could educate, develop, form people using spiritual disciplines that have been proven over many centuries. They don't just come in our orbit. A discipline of abstinence, as the language indicates, is something where a person withholds something themselves. Fasting would be an example, right? You're abstaining from food. Frugality would be one. I am making the conscious decision to do without so that I can be more generous. Whenever you've gotten up and asked somebody to, ask the church to give to something sacrificially, in essence, that's something you're doing. But I came to realize that, and then that project was written between 2008 and 2010, and if you don't remember what was going on during that time, everybody's financial lives are falling apart at that point in time. So some people got to live frugally without choice. As I was teaching through this stuff in the church context, what I found was that there's something very, very appealing to people, very spiritual about it when somebody simply says, you know what, we realized at some point in time that we were spending $25,000 a year on travel sports for our kids, and we gave God $500 last year. And so we're going to try to flip that. We're actually going to withhold. Our kids are going to quit travel sports and play rec ball, and we're going to take that money and we're going to give it away. And maybe they do it in the church, maybe they do it elsewhere, but I've had people do that. But you're saying, I'm going to withhold this from myself and live frugally with the aim toward allowing God to empty me of something. Okay? So those are our disciplines of abstinence. Fasting would be another example. Our staff at Highland Oaks, we made the decision that we were all going to fast once a week at lunchtime and take, a per diem amount of that, so to speak, and donate it to the capital campaign. But spend that time not just in, hey, we're all going to try to lose weight or something. That the aim of it was, we think there's power in denying our flesh. And as we do that, we're going to do it for a higher cause. We're going to do it for a higher purpose. We're going to do this. So we spent our time praying, and we brown bagged it for, not brown bagged it in the sense that we ate our lunch, but we just said, we're not eating out. We're not doing this. We'd all meet in the lunchroom on Tuesday, and we would simply pray instead of eating. But there are disciplines of abstinence that we can teach our folks that will help contribute to this. I highly prefer the disciplines of engagement. Okay, that's Will's term for it. And here you have things like study and preaching and prayer and fellowship. But in each of these cases, what you're asking people to do is to do something proactive. You're not withholding things from yourself. You're putting them, you're actually choosing to engage. So a spiral style curriculum where during each of the 2 years, there was a component of preaching and teaching that was woven through there. There were times and seasons of prayer, fellowship or study in there. And there were times where we called on the church to live frugally, to fast, and to engage in disciplines of abstinence. And those went on in contexts on a repeatable basis. So for instance, last year here at New Village Church, we engaged in a church-wide campaign to sponsor children through Compassion International in a really kind of interesting endeavor that would allow us to, through sponsoring children, help get churches planted also in the third world. But in order to do it, I could have said either one, would you just give it, right? That's one way to do it. What we chose to do last year was something that some of your churches have done in very intensive campaigns, but we've kind of taken this into the Advent season, so to speak. We don't call it that here, but that's kind of what we're doing around this time of year. We will ask them to withhold something as a part of the process of giving it. And don't have to help sponsor a kid. Do without something as you do it, or do without something in order to do it. And that ends the act of abstaining from something. So if you want, you can do it through fasting, you can do it through frugality. Your family could say, this year we're doing each of our kids is we're gonna sponsor a kid for each child in our family instead of doing Christmas gifts. Okay, things like that would be examples of the disciplines of abstinence. And by saying that, there's something unusually spiritually powerful about doing that with people. And one of the things is we're just learning to say no to our flesh and our impulse to buy things and consume things. And there is great power in that. And so one year we'll do that. The next year it'll be engagement in that slot, okay? Each year we do something in a small group context. So, this year, for instance, we've done financial peace. We've done Dave Ramsey this year. Next year, it might be a 90-day tithe challenge concept, which is something if you've never done it, it's just the idea of taking Malachi and just saying, hey, what if we did test God and we just decided that we were all going to tithe for 90 days? First of all, your offerings go bananas if people actually started tithing. I know that one of the great myths out there is that all our people are really hurting and all that, and I'm not saying nobody's hurting. I'm just saying in most cases there is plenty of money to do absolutely anything that God would want you to do for the kingdom. God will provide it, and the people have it. It's just more a matter of trying to help them down that spiritual journey to be able to make that. So what you can do is if you wanted to put together your own plan, knowing your own people, your own preaching calendar, the way that your church is organized and set up, is you can take that funnel and either put 2 tracks on the inside of it, like railroad tracks. The other option would be that you could do one funnel and then next to it another funnel, and you have year 1 and year 2. But write down ongoing, what are the things that we're asking people to do on an ongoing basis? Abstinence, disciplines of abstinence, things that we're going to do without in order to help move this along. And so, for instance, corporately as a church, there can be disciplines of abstinence. Churches will say, for instance, like we did this year, we said, look, we're at a point where we're to be able to just sit here and still view ourselves as a mission case, but we feel like it's important that we force ourselves to get into the church multiplication business. God's presented us some opportunities, so we're gonna do this. So this year, the Sunday before Thanksgiving, we're not anything that goes in the plate is going to be going out the door toward church multiplication. Okay, we're choosing to do without so that they can have, and allowing ourselves to. And so in our case, we've had to say, so therefore, because we're doing that, here's some of the things that we're sacrificing in order to make that happen, and we do it with full belief that God's going to bless it. When I was at Highland Oaks, I'll give you an example of how we did this. Right in the middle of a $4.5 million remodel of our entire facility, which we had just paid off, by the way. It was really popular move. But it needed to happen. It had been 25 years, and the thing already needed some help. And we're doing a $4.5 million remodel. And after we take a wrecking ball to the whole auditorium, and the church is meeting in the fellowship hall, Hurricane Katrina happened. Now we're in Dallas, right? So they're busing people in to stay in Texas and things like that. It was the worst catastrophe that anything could happen. What we were planning on, we had a 3,200 seat auditorium, okay, at the time, and we were planning on selling the pews to the tune of about $500,000. And what we decided to do instead, we went to the church with them and we said, look, this is what the elders feel like we're calling to do, but instead of selling those, we're going to take them and donate them to churches in New Orleans. And you need to understand that because of that, that's going to leave a gap in this campaign that we have, and in our budget. And so, but we feel like this is something that God would want us to do. We have brothers and sisters in need, and we have stuff that they could use and that we're going to get rid of. And we just feel like rather than selling them to people who could buy pews from somebody else, we should give them away. And so that's what we did. And we took 2 or 3 months, and just every weekend we took a load of pews down there, put them in churches for the needy down there. Wouldn't you know, we got to the end of the year, the church just rose up, blew right past our budget goals, and fully backfilled that project. And yet at the same time, we helped all of those needy churches. So that would be an example of how we're doing without this. And that by doing it, what it did was it helped demonstrate what generosity looks like through abstinence for people. And then they were willing to do the same. And when it came time for us to just point out, I literally got up, I think it was like December 10th or so, and I just said, hey, I want to remind you that this is what we did. And so if you look in your bulletin and you're terrified at what looks like the budget number, we told you that was going to come, and it's come. So if you're here at the end of the year, you're going to get a bonus, or you've got, God's blessing in some way, and you want to give some extra for the sake of the kingdom, we'd love for you to do that. I think we overshot our budget by $110,000. I think we were in the hole going into the month. We were in the hole about $100,000. It was amazing to watch the outpouring from the people. So that's abstinence. Engagement would be, something. What is it that I'm asking them to do proactively? Withhold. But am I wanting them to study something? Am I wanting them to show up for a night of worship? Where we're just going to talk about nothing but generosity. Are we going to ask them to commit to something? A 90-day tithe challenge, or are we going to ask them to get involved in a Dave Ramsey style class around anything like that? What is it exactly that I want to ask them to do? And then I guess the last thing, because I know I'm out of time, I don't know if there's time for questions here, that I would consideration to is the whole individuality. That everything that I do financially is between me and God. I really, 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 really don't think that holds up well under scriptures like it's very American, but it's not necessarily biblical in the sense of whenever you see these kinds of things brought up, even to the point, things like the story of the widow's mite. Jesus points at 2 people and he says, hey, look at those people giving over there. Look what she gave, look what he gave. I tell you, she's the one whose sacrifice was viewed most righteously in the eyes of God, right? Well, there's Jesus knocking 2 myths out in it. It's not paradigmatic for every church in America, I don't think, but it is important. Number one, the myth that if I'm poor, I shouldn't have to give. If I'm poor, then God doesn't expect me to give anything. That's not true. The widow story really blows that out of the water. It's really not about how much you give. It is about your heart when you give, and it's about the sacrifice that goes with it. And that just because you give out of your excess doesn't mean you were generous. If you give $2,000 a week and this single mom over here gets $5 a week, it may be that her sacrifice is viewed as greater and has God more righteous than the guy who has more money, right? So he dispels one myth, and then the other is the idea that nobody's giving ever is on record. And keep in mind that many of these stories that we hear in the text that we preach from, letters written to churches, and that in some cases names are given, Ananias and Sapphira being one example of that, and others. And so I think at one level, we're going to have to help people understand corporately that just like we're committed to your spiritual growth in the aspects of sexual purity, or in the growing as a student of the Word, growing in worship, growing in holiness, that this is a key part of it. Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. You can't serve 2 masters, and all these things. And so they need to hear strongly from leadership. We are committed to helping you grow in this vital area of discipleship, just like we are other areas. And if we have gotten up and pretended like somehow God doesn't care, or that's like your own little private playground, and you can do what you want over there and nobody's going to care, then we send you the message. We do care, and God cares. And so, we want you to know that that's something that we take seriously, and that we're going to take seriously going forward. And then I've always found that it's good to be able to get up as a leader and say, I want you to know that everybody in leadership here, every elder, every church member is tithing and beyond. Okay? So that's what we've done at those things, because otherwise they're going to look at you and turn their head like so and wonder, are you doing it? And when we say that, it's a way of us helping say, we're in it with you. Here at New Vintage, we mentioned that, but those who were here in the early going know that the people that were here to help start this church sometimes, gave 40 or 50% in order to get our church off the ground. And that legacy of generosity is something I think God has blessed. And here we are 3.5 years later, no debt in a building we own outright, and just through a series of miracles. But I think going back, I look at it, feel like God knew we would use it, and that generous act of God toward us and the church that bequeathed it to us is something that we need to seriously and be generous with it. So that's what we try to do every day here. I know I'm over my time, so I'm going to hit the pause button right there and ask, what would you guys like to talk about? I can't hear any.
They're thinking.
I see a hand up in the back of the room.
I don't mean this to be a funny question, but I'm asked this a fair amount. When you talk about tithing, people say, do you want me to tithe on the gross or on the net?
Yeah.
So how do you respond to that question?
Well, I would say gross, and then I could give you a lengthy explanation on that, but what it boils down to me, tithing is clearly seen as a minimum. And when it comes down to net, that gets a little bit weird for people, because by net, do you mean after taxes? Does that mean after taxes and groceries and essentials and things like that? I think we pay our taxes and everything like that, but yeah, you gave the first fruit of your crops, you gave your 10th before the taxes were even paid. Back in the day, now you paid your taxes, don't mishear me there. But it wasn't, in our system, see, you don't get your until after Caesar's already taken his taxes. That's not the way it went down back then. The way it went back then was you got paid and then you need to give it to Caesar. He's gonna come collecting it. And so sometimes we can get, mixed up that way. And so what I would encourage people to do is just say, man, that thing ought to go out 10%. That's your first fruit. That goes out first. And then, whatever taxes need to be paid. Now, here's the other thing that I notice tends to happen too, is that people get raises and stuff, but their giving never goes up. If they get a tax refund, do they tithe on that, for instance? I think one of the things we have to reinforce with people is the spirit of the law on this, which is, I'm not trying to get away with giving God the absolute minimum that I have to and be able to look myself in the mirror. I'm trying to view everything that I own. Well, first of all, I don't own it. I've entrusted it to me. I am a trustee of something that God's entrusted to me. And the question is, and it's Richard Foster's old question of not much how much should I give, but how much of God's money should I keep? That's really more the question. I've gotten that hundreds of times, so I know exactly where you're coming from and have great empathy for where you sit with that question. But from a spiritual standpoint, if you applied that to other areas of spiritual life, it would sound absurd. Take it over into Bible reading, prayer, it gets a little bit odd. So if we can help people maybe draw a parallel there and help them understand, look, don't get into playing tit for tat with God on things like this. If the spirit behind it isn't the first fruits kind of thing, that ought to go first. It ought to be the single most important thing you do with your money. Absolutely pay your taxes faithfully. But in our situation, just the fact that we tend to get our money after taxes does not mean that God's tithe gets taken out of what you've already paid to Caesar. Does that make sense? That's how I would word it to people.
We've got one over.
Because otherwise, Caesars get, in essence, proportionally more of a cut than God does.
I had a.
By virtue of going down that way.
We've got another question, Tim.
I had a comment on that question.
Okay.
I had a real hard time getting to the point where I could tithe because of my upbringing, but I finally got to where I was tithing, and a Baptist preacher who was a tennis playing friend of mine was the one who helped me with it. But then I had that same question. I called him up. I said, Dan, am I supposed to tithe at gross or at net? And he had a real simple answer. He said, well, do you want God to bless you at gross or at net? That's a,
Yeah. Do you guys find that your churches you find get big and irritable when you guys talk about money from the pulpit?
Yeah, I don't know that we found that they get irritable. Usually we hear from the ones, it's kind of like preaching to the choir. The people that give a lot come back and go, I feel like you're constantly asking me to give more and to give more and to give more. Whereas the folks who tend not to give or given that third of under 500, they tend to avoid the conversation completely.
Yeah.
So I don't hear from them at all.
How would you introduce the concept of to a congregation that does not show what they give individually, but if you were in a situation where you were moved to go that route, how did you introduce that concept to a congregation that's done in the past?
Who would they be showing it to, or who would get shown the information?
Okay. You tell me. How would you divulge that by the envelope system, or would you? How's it done? I've never been part of a congregation that divulged that, so I don't know.
Well, let me tell you how we did it at Highland Oaks. I'll tell you how we do it at New Advantage, and then maybe one of those two will work. At Highland Oaks, they all knew that my predecessor knew what they gave, and they were pretty comfortable with that. The elders wanted to shut that down when I came, and so they didn't want to let me know. But when it came time to try to raise $4.5 million, I'm supposed to do that when I don't know what anybody gives. I don't even know where to go to ask for the money. And so they said, okay, here you go, and they let me look at it. First, with no amounts next to it, 0 to the top 25 givers, but even then, it's better, but it doesn't help because I can't. But when you're trying to raise money for a special project, you need to know what their capacity is at some level, and you can only know that through the giving. What I've tried to help the church understand is, if Jesus says where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And if one of the best ways to help shepherd, one of the ways that we know we can help shepherd people best is, and where we know that they're having problems, or they're upset about something or whatever, is we just notice the giving drops off, it gets less regular, and things like that, and to say, look, we want to be a blessing to you if you're in debt. We want to help you get out. If you are struggling financially, we want to be a blessing to you. But we all need to own the fact that the mission that God calls us to, for the most part, there are a lot of things that you can do that are free in ministry, but a lot of things are not. And that in order for us to be able to do what God has us to do, it's hard to plant churches for free. It's hard to help the poor for free. It can be done, almost anything that it would take to do that's worthwhile in the kingdom of God. I think sometimes getting up and just simply telling them, look, this is an area that we want to improve as a leadership team in our spiritual development of everybody that attends here. And maybe even admitting, I don't feel like we've done a great job of that in this past, and part of it is we bought into this idea that somehow it's not worth talking about, or that every time that we talk about it, everybody has to get defensive. It has to get angry. Everybody has to do that. We don't have to be that way, brothers and sisters. And in order for us to be able to go to the next level as a church and to fulfill the calling that God has given to our church, we're going to have to get past it. And we want to help in that process. We want it to start today. I think sometimes, helping people understand what really happens in the giving process and what level of spiritual warfare there is important. In the month at Highland Oaks, the 2 weeks that I spent working on the capital campaign, I got obliterated. I mean, I had people coming at me from all sorts of angles about all sorts of things. But the thing that bothered me the most was I got all this heat from people who were quite well off, people who were, given the widow's mite. These are people that live in big houses, drive big cars, and do all sorts of things. And they were very upset that I would be asking them for it. And there's it's amazing how if you're reading the scripture with a lens of generosity on it, how God can, in very timely fashion, show up and teach us some things. If you ever read the book of Haggai, that's a great place to go. Just an obscure, random Bible story that you can introduce to your church. There, the issue is they're rebuilding the temple, and God looks at the job they're doing, and he goes, wait, what? What is that? Did any of you see the last one? Why is it that you guys are living in paneled houses and my house is a wreck? Right? Or some who would say, well, for people who say God doesn't want us to spend money on buildings. Well, he had his chance. The temple was lying in ruins, right? But they rebuilt it. And when they do, he wants it to be done well. The question there theologically is, why are you all living in such great houses and then essentially the church building's a wreck? Okay. Another would be the story from the time of Moses, where the people literally give much that he has to tell them to stop. That story has real power. So you can go to the text with it. There are sample sermons in the back of that project that I wrote, Abilene. There's a sermon plan for a sermon series, and some of this I don't mind emailing to you guys, and you can steal the sermons, steal the outlines, steal the whatever, and you want is fine for this group. Just don't reproduce it in mass is all I'd ask. But I think one of the best ways to disarm people is to just show some vulnerability and admit that we haven't always done a good job of doing this, but we want to do a better job start today at helping shepherd through this really important area of discipleship. So maybe in the past you've heard us apologize for this. We're not going to do that anymore. Maybe in the past we haven't done a good job painting the vision for what it is that I said this Sunday at an event I studied yesterday. I got up and I said to the church, I said, I know as a giver sometimes it can be hard to really get a really clear sense of what happens when I feel like I'm putting this money in the plate and I don't know where it goes, so to speak. And I said, let me tell you where it goes. And I didn't go through a good report or anything like that. And I said it's, because you give, there are kids in places in need that are being taken care of, with people in our body that are in need that are being cared for. The Word of God is being preached. We're being led in worship. Churches outside of ours are being resourced. We open source a lot of our stuff that we produce, our artwork and sermon content and music and all sorts of stuff. We've got, and I just started rattling them off in a way that was where I wanted them to see in my face, I care about this. I feel like this is worth giving to. And then I reminded them, I said, I know it can be hard. I'm a giver too. And that's why it's important that we spend our time focusing on the stuff that does in our midst. this is kind of a Philippians 4:8, whatever is good, whatever is noble, whatever is praiseworthy. Think about these things. Oops, sorry. I misquoted that because I was kicking a hard drive under my desk here. But to me, vulnerability goes a long way with people. Whenever we try to just simply say, we just need more money, don't say that. I would just get up and say, you know what, in the past, use an opportunity where the text already speaks to it and take that opportunity to just, open your heart up a little bit in front of people and say, we're going to do better. Starting today, we're going to do better, trying to help shepherd you through this. And following Jesus as faithfully as we know how ourselves. We're not going to ask you to do things that we're not doing as leaders. So there you go.
One more question?
I have one. I see generosity or lack of it as any other sin or as any other spiritual discipline. Do people ever come to you to discuss that problem in their own lives, that they're not as generous as they would like to be, and how they can get past that?
Rarely. I have had it happen. But again, that's part of it is, if you're able to help tie this in, with discipleship as a whole, then it will really, it will carry the day. And I've had more of that at New Vintage than I ever had at Highland Oaks or West Houston. Because I was able to shape that here. And people, I think, showed up with the expectation that if we don't give to this, it ain't gonna make it. So there was a little bit of an impulse there. I wish I could say that happened frequently, but it does not. But I do have it here. Yesterday I had somebody come up, made a pledge on the campaign, and they said, you know what? I'm upset with myself because we made a pledge to the Trellis Project is the name of the campaign. And because we just made some bad decisions in terms of spending, we're going to have to pull back on our pledge, or we're going to have to take a longer period of time to fulfill it. And I told him, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you trusting me with that information. And I appreciate the heart behind it, and I think God's going to honor your contrition and your desire to do the right thing. Thank you for doing it. And let us know what you think that means. And can I come back to you in a week or so and just check in and see if spend some time with your husband and figure out what you think it's going to look like, and let us know. But that exchange was amazing. That's a very rare thing. But as you guys as church leaders and preachers are able to help them understand, look, part of what it means to follow Christ is you can't serve both God and money. One more thing I would add is you always give people an out these days. We always say, God doesn't just want your money, He wants your time. Don't just give your money, give your time and your this. Okay, that's fine. He does want your time, and all that goes into the bigger picture of offering your life as a living sacrifice. But He doesn't use time in the Sermon on the Mount. He talks very specifically about money, and there's a reason for it, I believe, and that is because it does have an uncommon spiritual hold on people, and that's why churches fight about it all the time. One of the reasons why a person in our church right now who's a quote-unquote concerned member who gives almost nothing and does nothing in the church, but is very concerned about what they think the staff makes. So we don't disclose that information because we understand in part the spiritual hold that has on people. Now we tell the church how much money we spend on payroll as a whole, but we don't get into specifics about who makes what, in part because we know how much of a spiritual issue it is for people, and we don't want the body to be thrown into disunity by arguing over how much they so-and-so ought to make, and we want our staff to do that. We don't want our staff to say, I think I ought to be making more than him or her or whatever. And so we don't disclose that information. But you can see even if I told you the details of it, how extremely passionate and strong the feelings about money are. And if we just tell people, and I've heard it, I don't give my money, but I give my time. Well, it's not supposed to be an either or. It's supposed to be both and. And just because you gave your time does not mean that God doesn't have some things to disagree or about in possessions and stuff like that. So again, going back in the spirit of just plowing under our own crops and not wanting to do that, I would encourage you to try to stay away from always giving them an escape in terms of dealing with the actual question at hand, which is monetary giving. So.
Very good. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. I'd like to ask.
Got some great guys in that room from great churches, and I hope God just continues to bless your church immensely. And if there's anything I can get to you, let me know. I'll be happy to send it to you, okay?
Thank you.
Very good. I'd like to ask Joe Roberts from the College Side Church in Cookville to pray a blessing over you, Tim.
That'd be great.
Thank you. Well, Father, we're so grateful for this time together to grow and to learn, and for Tim sharing his learning and his experiences and his energy and effort, the way he blessed his life, the way that the Spirit is guiding him. We thank you for being able to address this issue, that we might be able to be more equipped to help our members and to do a better job of discipling our folks, to help us personally as we wrestle with what you've blessed us with, to recognize this is truly a blessing, to be used and be generous and kind and compassionate in our service to you always. Be with Tim and the ministry he's doing now and the work that he's doing. We'll continue to bless their efforts as they reach out and share this good news and to share your message with the lost. And it's through your son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, my friend.
Hey, thank you, Tim.
Take care.
Bless you guys.
Goodbye.